started. Yes. I'm Guy McLain. I'm the director here at the Athenaeum. I'm so glad to see such a great crowd here tonight. This is really great. We're really excited about the opening of the new history exhibits. I think it'll be really nice to have this available to the public. Whenever the library's open, our history exhibits will be open now, which is really, I think it's a nice thing to have. It'll allow students to anyone else to come in and see the history, the great artifacts we have here, and the history of Westfield. So I'm very excited to see some good turnout. I just want to make, before I turn it over to Bob, I just want to make a couple of announcements. We have a couple of great activities planned. Yeah, yes, a couple of seats up here, a couple right down there. There's plenty of availability here. Yeah. It's funny we were able to get this many chairs in the place. But I just want to make an announcement because we have some great activities coming up this fall that I want to let everybody know about. We have a trip on October 28th. We have a trip to the Boston Symphony planned. We provide the transportation. We have lunch set up at a restaurant just a block away from Symphony Hall. And we have a great concert there. There's still tickets available, but if you want to go, contact us, come by the Athenaeum and sign up really quickly because we have to let the Symphony know about the ticket, how many tickets we'll need and this sort of thing. So if you want to go on that trip, it's October 28th. It's going to be the Friday afternoon concert, which is really nice. It means you'll be back in Westfield by probably 6:30 or 7 in the evening, which is really nice. So that should be a really great trip, but do sign up quickly for that. On November 3rd, if you haven't seen, Laura Radwell is the artist in our gallery right now. Her exhibit will be up through the end of October. On November 3rd, we have our next artist in, Frank Grassotti, who's a Westfield native and has been an art teacher for many, many years. He will be our next artist, and the opening for the artist reception is on November 3rd, Thursday night, November 3rd, 6 o'clock, just like tonight, the reception tonight. So I hope you can join us for that. And then on December 2nd, we have our annual wine tasting. We had a great time last year. I think it'll be even bigger and better this year. So make sure to put that on your calendar for December 2nd to come to the wine tasting. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bob. Everybody knows Bob. I don't know introduce him.
I'm going to do something a little bit different tonight. I've been asked, rather than the straight historical talks that I've usually given, I've been asked to talk about the collection, the museum. How did it get here? What happened to it? Why are you seeing some things and not others? So, and by the way, you're going to be told some of the dirty linen around here too, because not all good things happened over the years. But I think you need to understand the practical realities of collections like this. To tell you the truth, every place in the world, not just little museums like here at Westfield, but big ones also. Now, this place began in 1864 as a chartered corporation created specifically by the legislature. Now, I emphasize that because it's important about why things happened the way they did. And it's also important because as much as I've repeated it over the years, most people in Westfield still do not understand this is a private institution. It is not a public library. It is one of about 20 odd libraries left in Massachusetts that are private institutions established by a separate bill in the legislature and governed under that. Now, from 1864 to 1927, this institution could not fulfill its charter. Its charter said it was going to be an Athenaeum, and I suppose some of you probably always wondered why it has that kind of strange name. Well, part of it is because it was trying to copy the Boston Athenaeum, which is a very, very famous place. But the word in Greek means a place of learning. And in the charter for this place, it said it was going to be a place for a library and for exhibits and for lectures. So that's what it was set up to be. The problem was, from 1864 to 1927, the buildings which were inhabited by this institution were too small to do anything except have a few books. They just couldn't do anything else. Now, nobody paid an awful lot of attention to that until 1919. And that's when the city of Westfield celebrated its 250th anniversary. And as part of that celebration, they created a hostess house. Now, I assume nobody knows what that means, but it's a place for ladies who go to the bathroom. That's what it means. And the hostess house was in the Strong Mansion, which is across the street next to the fire station. It's the American Legion home. That was the hostess house. The city had recently taken it over, and they were going to put the first trade school in that building. That's where it began. But in 1919, it was available, and so what they did is they set up a lounge for ladies, and they had a lot of extra room, and so they decided to put a museum. It's the 250th anniversary of the city. Why don't we focus on historical objects? And they called upon people in the city to donate historical items to put them on display. And it was very popular. People really loved it. By the way, we have photographs of the exhibits and things in here, if anybody wants to see what they did. Well, when it was all over with, there was a lot of talk in the city. You know, we've got a historical community. We ought to do something about it. We ought to have a permanent museum. Time passed. Luckily, Milton B. Whitney, very prominent corporate attorney in town and very important in the history of this library, the Whitney study is upstairs, he had died and he had left a large sum of money to build a more appropriate building. And that money was coming due. He said if it wasn't spent within 10 years, it went to Amherst, I think, something like that. And so the 10-year deadline was coming up. They decided they better spend it fast. And so they built the 1927 library. Essentially, that is this building without the reference extension and the extension of the Boys and Girls Library. But it's the big hall and the read room and this room. It's the museum or the library you're familiar with. When they built it, they planned on putting a room in to have those lectures. Here we are. And an art gallery, that was upstairs, the Rand. And somebody said, well, why don't we put a museum? We'll do everything. And so John Reed's father and William Smith, the son of Ed Smith, who had founded the foundry, and the son of Mr. Strong said, all right, we'll contribute the money to add a museum on. And so in 1927, they built the little upstairs museum that many of you remember. Many of you came in, I assume, as school children. That was the standard thing. They built the museum. Now they needed a collection. Well, that was going to be a problem. And the main reason it was going to be a problem is because this was a private library and it didn't have any money. In 1895, come on in, Harry, there are seats in here in the corner. In 1895, this private library struck an agreement with the city. Prior to 1895, in order to take books out, you had to join and pay an annual fee. There were less than 100 people in the city who were members of the library. Now, there were almost 20,000 people in the city at that point in time. Most people didn't have access to the library. And so the city and the library struck an agreement. The agreement was that the city would provide the dog tax, dog license fees, plus enough money to make $1,500. And that would be the city's financial contribution in exchange for the library being open to all citizens. That is the sole legal agreement which exists between this institution and the city of Westfield. I can tell you that there have been fights for the last 100 years over that, and they continue. But that's all there is, folks. But that's not enough money to run an art gallery and a lecture hall and a museum and all those other things. It, with the endowment, and I can tell you the endowment was always very small, with the endowment was enough to hire people to put books on shelves and take books out, but that was about it. Now what that meant then is that if you were going to have these art galleries and the rest of it, it had to be done with volunteers. Between 1927 and roughly the next 100 years, it wasn't quite 100 years, but almost 100 years, there were only 8 people who were in charge of the collection. Now, I'm only going to talk about the objects. I'm not going to talk about the art, and I'm not going to talk about the archives. Those are two separate things. We're only talking about the objects, like you see on display upstairs. There were only 8 people in that almost 100 years who were in charge. Only 4 of them were employees of the library. And only 1 of them had ever had any previous experience or training dealing with objects. The reality is that everything that happened in here dealing with the things was based on what well-meaning amateurs did. Good and bad. And before I talk about the larger part of it, let me make one thing absolutely clear. There were a lot of successes. They opened the upstairs museum. They created school visitation programs that ran for decades, bringing thousands of school students in here for programs dealing with Westfield history through its objects. They created tours for all kinds of people. We have guest books that go back nearly 100 years, showing people from all over the United States who came to our museum. They created exhibits. And a fascinating thing they did, they are probably responsible more than any other part of this institution for the public relations, because we've got scrapbooks full of the stories that they got in the newspapers. People read newspapers in those days, about their exhibits, about what was going on. So they had wonderful successes. Now on the other side, people in town treated the place as the community attic. If you didn't know what to do with it, and you didn't want to throw it away, you brought it down here. Because obviously they would love it. And they would take care of it. Now, that meant that an awful lot of unusual things came. The bulk of the things that came were fabrics. Now, some of them were spectacular. Next door to the library, where Berkshire Bank sits today, was the home of Miss Lucy Gillett. Her grandfather is James Fowler. His picture's up in the museum room you were just looking at over the fireplace. It's essentially the Fowler house that is the basis of the museum. They were a wealthy, prominent family, very famous in town. And near the end of her life in the 1940s, there was a fire in her house. Luckily, it was soon put out, but people decided they really ought to reduce the clutter in the house, and so they cleaned the attic out and brought most of the stuff here. An awful lot of it was clothing, the family's Victorian clothing. There was a huge amount of it. But some of the things were spectacular. Now, I can't pick it up and carry it, and I spread it here. But this, we guess, is a Kashmiri hand-woven shawl from the 19th century. And this black lozenge in the center has a signature in it that's done with white thread. We can't read whether it's Pashto or Arabic, but it's magnificent. It's as big as a bedspread. In those days, the shawl wrapped completely around the body. It's all hand-woven. It is magnificent. But how do we display it? How do we show it? Well, we have it. We also have this. I don't know whether you recognize what it is, but back in the Wild West days, there were buffalo. And people had buffalo robes that they kept warm on. Well, here is an authentic 19th century buffalo robe. One of the things we found, there was a wooden packing case that when we opened it, by the way, I use the word we. I and a group of volunteers worked in here for 10 years with the collection. A number of the volunteers are sitting here in the audience right now, so they know what we means. We found a packing case, and when we opened it, there were tobacco leaves on the top. We couldn't figure out why there were dried tobacco leaves, but it keeps moths away. And it was filled with bolts of fabric. And we couldn't figure out what it is, and when this is over with, come up and feel it. I think it's hemp cloth. I think. It's all hand-woven. Here you can see where they've tied it off, and the sticks are still on the end. Well, we have bolts of this. It came from, some of you heard me talk about the doctors Holland. It came from the last Dr. Holland, Dr. James Holland, who was a contract surgeon during the Philippine insurrection in 1900 in the Philippines, and this was a trunk from his family, and we think it's hand-woven hemp cloth from the Philippines. We have bolts of it, all kinds of colors. Now, I don't know what we're doing with it or why it probably shouldn't be here, but I don't know where it ought to go. We have it. Clothing. Mounds of clothing. Hundreds of pieces of clothing. Most of it is women's clothing. Most of it is late 19th century. And for the outer garments, it's almost entirely upper-class women's formal wear. Let's be honest, a working blue-collar immigrant woman in the 1870s, she doesn't have extra dresses to donate to the library. It doesn't work that way. We also got items that nobody was willing to throw away, although they should. An awful lot of the items would have little notes attached. This was my grandmother's favorite dish. But here's an example. This tea set came from one of the prominent families in town with a note from the person who brought it that this was my mother's tea set. She loved it and used it every day. Well, okay, why did you bring it to us? Particularly since the cover's missing from the sugar bowl. The creamer has got a big chip out of the lip. The teapot is busted and blown back together, and the snout is broken off. And by the way, this isn't a rare Copeland or anything like that. It's an American, late 19th century ceramic. Why didn't you throw it away? Well, you couldn't. It was your mother's. So you brought it down to the private library to take care of. I can tell you that we found boxes full of this stuff. It should have been thrown away, should have never come in. We got collections. We got salt and pepper shake collections. We got bell collections. We got elephant collections and turtle collections. We are the proud possessors of 700 watch fobs. Now, I can tell you that if you don't know what watch fob is, in the days before wristwatches, men had pocket watches. Men's pants still sometimes have a fob watch pocket. But pants are tight where the watches are, and you can't get at it, and so they had a fob on them so that you could pull the watch up. The watch was on this end, and this fob. Now, I can tell you that there is a world of collecting these things because you can have sports ones, you can have Masonic Society, you can have all kinds. Unfortunately, this collection is almost entirely 1940s and 50s heavy equipment. We may have 30 or 40 copies of the same bulldozer. We've got almost 700 of them. As I told you, there were only 8 people in charge of this during that almost century. And some of them probably stayed around longer than they should have. One of the persons, remember they had no supervision. They just did what they wanted to. One of the persons was not as efficient as she had once been. She brought in all of her third-class mail and assigned a session number to every piece of it and wrote it in the documents, and we found piles of it. She also brought her old shoes in and assigned those as session numbers. They were all here. Sometimes we got wonderful collections, but they weren't cared for very well. We had been working on this project, trying to figure out what was in here and sort it and stuff for a few years, and thought we'd gotten through a lot of it. And I was home one day and got a phone call from someone down here who said, "You better come down real quick." Now, this place has a lot of nooks and crannies. Back this way, there is the old boiler room. And off the old boiler room, there are brick-lined, dirt-floored root cellars that go back under the parking lot, under the old house. Well, to avoid tracking that dirt in and out of the building, someone in the distant past had put down layers of cardboard, so you could walk on the cardboard instead of the dirt floors. Because we were cleaning and sorting this stuff, one of the maintenance men here decided to help, and he decided he'd get that old cardboard out of there, and he grabbed a hold of one corner of it and started to lift it up, and the whole square of the room was attached. And so he started hauling away, and he discovered under the top layer of cardboard, you know, in World War I and World War II, the U.S. government created posters. Bond posters and recruiting posters and propaganda posters and eat more, less meat posters and all of that. Well, they produced them by the hundreds of thousands, and they sent them out to towns all over America and said, hang these posters in public places. Well, your public places are City Hall, the library, and the post office. But they never hung them here. They just piled them up. And somewhere after it was all over with, somebody had these stacks of posters they had to do something with. And so they took them in there and laid them on the ground. Hundreds of posters were under this layer of cardboard. Now, some were damaged, obviously, and some were lost, but an awful lot of them weren't. Trouble is, they're fragile paper. And to do anything, you know, these are reproductions around here, but even to frame something like that, if you talk about framing 10 of them, you can afford it, but what are you going to do with 100 of them? And then where are you going to store them? Well, we saved a few, and we put them on shrink wrap, and we have a group of them we have kept we can use for displays and exhibits. But we got $15,000 for the rest of them. Wow. Stuff came in. All kinds of stuff. Now, as this stuff came in, dealing with it, remember, is the volunteer. The volunteer has got to deal with this. How do you deal with it? Particularly, you've had no training, nobody's explained to you what to do, you've never done it before, so each person invented how they dealt with it. Some people wrote down record keeping. Some people did that. Some people didn't do that. Some people did it one day and didn't do it the other day. And the problem is, you see, this stuff did not come to these 8 people over this almost century. It came to the front desk. So whoever was at the front desk, somebody walked in and said, here, Well, maybe it got processed, maybe it didn't. There was also the problem as this stuff came in, it was just piled. And unfortunate things happened to some of it. I mean, quite honestly, over the nearly century of time, things vanished. I can tell you from the records we saw that coin collections and stamp collections and jewelry collections are much less than the records show. That's reality. You know, stuff is piled in a corner somewhere. People come and go. There was another problem. A lot of other organizations in town who did not have a building said, well, this is the community attic. Why don't you hang on to our things temporarily? The Historical Society, Kiwanis, Grandmother's Garden, at least 3 different women's clubs, the First Church, the 250th Anniversary Committee, the 300th Anniversary Committee, all of them brought records, objects, and said, here, you hang on to this till we need it. Well, it got put in the corner with the rest of the stuff. Additionally, these well-meaning administrators of all of this would get a great idea for an exhibit. Let's have an exhibit on the businesses in town. And the businessmen who were in town, they'd go to them and say, look, could you loan us something from your business? And we'll put it in this exhibit. And the exhibits were great, but the stuff was on loan. Well, maybe it got handed back the day after the exhibit was done, but things were more casual in the 40s. Everybody knew everybody in the 50s, 60s. Everybody knew everybody. And, well, I'll get it to you when I see you next month, maybe. And then there were those very generous people who said, well, you're going to have an exhibit on colonial clothing, and my grandmother's wedding dress would fit in just perfectly. Let me loan that to you. I can tell you that during my time doing this, I had people I'd never seen before show up in here and say, my grandmother 47 years ago loaned you and I'd like it back. I mean, without records being kept quite often and this stuff intermingled, who knew what was going to happen? And then there were worse problems. Historical Society is the most guilty party in this, because the Historical Society also collected objects, just like the museum did. So when you give that cast iron, sad iron to the Historical Society, and the museum has one, and the Historical Society stores it here, how do you know which one belongs to whom? Particularly if it's been stored here for 50 years, and everybody's dead who brought it in originally. Well, that was okay until the early 1970s when the Historical Society decided to create the Dewey House. And the project managers of the Dewey House and the officers of the Historical Society and the officers of the trustees of this library and the managers of the collection here were the same people. An awful lot of objects were sold to raise money for the Dewey House. And I'll tell you quite honestly, many of those objects, it was not clear who owned them. Now, at the same time that was happening, there was a great deal of remodeling taking place in the library itself. And again, large numbers of objects were sold to pay for that remodeling. And the only records kept were 67 paintings sold $1,200. Just single lines like that. There were no rules. There was no there were policies, but there were no followed policies. And nobody was in charge except people who were dealing with the issues of the day. Finally, in 1990, I think it was, the third of a succession of budget crises meant that essentially people just gave up. They had just recently hired the first professional to manage the collection, and she was let go. I think she was here about a year, and she was let go, and the museum was then closed. People just decided, we can't do this anymore, we cannot manage this stuff. And for the next 10 years, nobody was in charge. Well, that didn't stop stuff coming in, and it didn't stop stuff going out, but nobody was in charge. About 20 years ago, a group, and as I said, a number of them are sitting here, a group was put together to try and get some control of this, get some management of it. Again, it was all volunteers. Again, it was not people legally employed in the institution. And again, to be quite honest, they had no supervision. It was volunteers trying to do the best they could. They raised some money. They got the museum open again. They got the school groups coming back. They got the tours coming back. They got lots of publicity again. They weeded out literally tons of junk. They sold things, but this time they kept records, documents. So if somebody comes along and says, why did you do this and what happened? There's a record. At least you can trace it. They created secure storage for the first time. And they began the process of creating proper archival storage and care. They began the process. They tried to create a catalog. And we're now in the computer world, so the obvious thing is you create a computer catalog. You take a computer picture and you assign a computer number and you put it in a computer place. The idea was good, but these were amateurs. There was only one person in the group who knew anything about computers, and that person did it as best they could, but they didn't do any backup. And after they'd spent 5 years on it, somebody stole the laptop. That process ended about 9 years ago. Things got more confused thereafter. There have been 5 directors of the library in the last 9 years. There have been, depending on how you count, 5 or 6 different people who've been assigned to deal with the collection. Some of them only lasted a couple of months. And things staggered forward. About a year ago, under new direction, a series of decisions were made to try and fix things in a more permanent, livable direction. You see part of that upstairs. It's an attempt to overcome some essential problems that are never going to change. That is, to be realistic. Funding does not exist to have an art director, an archivist, and a museum director in here. It does not exist. I know of no way it's ever going to exist. But there are things that can be done, and upstairs is a start on those things. There is a new attempt to get rigorous policies enforced. And this time, there is the beginnings of a real plan at the center for the first time in 100 years to permanently deal with a collection that's filled with wonderful things. Yes, there's still some weird things that there's a serious question whether they ought to still be here, but there are wonderful things. We discovered amazing things. One last story. In the upstairs museum, that had been closed, as I told you, for 13 years. And it had become a repository for all kinds of junk, including old newspapers. I have no idea what old newspapers were taken up there, but they were piled on the floor. And we were cleaning them up and taking the pile of newspapers out, and there was a cigar box in the pile of newspapers on the floor. And when we opened the cigar box, it had a bunch of Kennedy and Nixon and Johnson campaign pins. Yeah. I mean, it was a collection, okay, but nothing spectacular, though pretty ordinary stuff. But there was one pin that looked strange. And it was about the size of a $50, and it was silvery colored, and it just said, "Long live the president," around the outside. Well, we decided to try and figure out what in the world it was. It was George Washington's original inaugural button. It was not a campaign pin, it was a button. It had a little tab in the back where you sewed it on your coat. It was a pewter, George Washington, original, and it was in this box, laying on a pile of newspapers on the floor. There are other treasures. If you hang around long enough and we get this thing moving well, we'll be able to show you a lot more of them. Thank you. If you have any comments or questions, I'll respond. Well,
I have one.
yeah.
Where do you keep all this stuff?
Well, first of all, and some of you know because some of you have had access, there are attics over this whole thing. They're huge attics. There are also, as I told you, there are back through that way, there are rooms that go back under the parking lot. Now, there isn't much stored back there anymore, but down here in the basement, we did create a locked storage area for the fabric material. Most of the other materials upstairs. Some of you may have noticed, and you've been here long enough, you may remember when the, as you go into the main library and look up, you'll see the open stories above you. Well, back, one of the things that we did 15 years ago was to enclose that third story, and that is a climate-controlled archival area up there. And I didn't talk and have not talked about archives at all, and the archive story is a bit different. But that's for the paper history of the city. And then there are attics above that where all stuff is. Yes?
Yeah, and on the fabrics, at George Washington University, there's a professional textile museum, which is absolutely wonderful. Perhaps you or one of your associates could contact them, and I think with a description, you know, one of the specialists might come here, and maybe even an arrangement could be made to, I mean, one of the more valuable ones perhaps, to do a loan to them.
Well, I mean, I understand that. In fact, there's right outside of Worcester, Lowell has an excellent textile museum also. The problem is, and you're absolutely right, and that's absolutely what should be done, just like in a lot of other absolutes. Who's going to do it? You've got to have volunteers. That means somebody's got to supervise the volunteers. An awful lot of the tasks we're talking about are very doable. We know how to do them. We know what should be done, but it takes labor. And who's going to do it? In big institutions, you have professionals. We've never been able to afford the professionals. Any other? Yes?
I guess to kind of piggyback off of that, is there going to be, or is there plans to try to educate future archivists or members to kind of take over these jobs? Kind of the next generation?
I'll turn that over to the director.
Yes, absolutely. We're in the process right now of hiring an archivist who will come in. Now, the collections have to be treated somewhat differently than archival collections, but we do have options. So we are definitely professionalizing the organization in a way that has not been done in the past. Yes, and that's an ongoing process, but we're right in the middle of that. And the exhibits upstairs are kind of the beginning of more professional exhibits, as well as a process of professionalizing the care of the collections as well.
Are you going to do a speaker series, Guy, that either you or somebody else can talk to? You said you didn't talk about the archives, you could talk about other collections, and you could charge something.
It's one of the agreements of this place is that we do not charge fees.
Oh.
It's part of the agreement.
If you put the hat out?
Well, that's a different story. I can assure you that there are various people here who are always happy to receive any contributions that anyone is willing to make. Yes?
Is the George Washington on display?
No. There are lots of things like that. I mean, we have such things as Lincoln campaign ballots. We have the famous Paul Revere letter. Paul Revere, you know, one of his jobs was casting bells, and he cast a bell for the First Congregational Church. And they said they didn't like it. They said it sounded lousy, and they wrote to him and said they wanted their money back. Well, we have a letter from Paul Revere saying, "How dare you insult our bell?" We've got fun things like that. They're not things that can. They're things that have in the past occasionally been on display. Every museum in the world, every collection in the world faces the reality that 90% or more of its collection never sees the light of day.
Can you make an appointment to ask to see it?
Well,
Yes, you can. And let me just elaborate on that. Yes, there are many things that we have that are not on display. I mean, it was really hard making the choices that we made for the items that we selected. And so that's one of the reasons for the other case, the case where we're going to do rotating exhibits, because we realize there's hundreds, if not thousands, of items that we love to show. And so the plan is that we're going to try to do 2 exhibits a year, about 1 every 6 months. We're on a different theme, so we'll be able to bring out a lot of those materials that are not on display. But the other exhibit is kind of an overview exhibit. So we tried to choose the most representative items to kind of represent different periods in Westfield history. But the other case that's now dedicated to the 1920s, that we'll rotate that on other themes. And so a lot of that material will come out eventually as we do future exhibits.
yes.
Bob, were you one of those school children who visited the museum here?
No, I'm not native here. In fact, I kind of backed into all this. I'm a retired professor of African and Middle Eastern history. I kind of backed into local history and Westfield and libraries and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Are there any things like the George Washington's button that should go to the Smithsonian?
No, because they would just bury it. They got stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, this stuff is unique here, certainly. Dennis?
One statement, one question. The Lowell Textile Museum closed and they have to find places to send all their stuff.
Oh,
So stuff
okay.
isn't going there. And is it true that the Athenaeum owned one of Lafayette's swords?
Yes, the sword that's on display, the little short sword that's on display upstairs, that sword was given to William Shepherd during the Revolutionary War. No, he was not a general during the war. He was a colonel. The family lore is that it was given to him by George Washington. No, it was not. Shepherd was a regimental colonel, ultimately I think a brigade colonel, in Lafayette's division of the Continental Army. And at one point, supposedly, Lafayette gave him that, it's called a short sword, a gentleman's sword. I don't think sword fighting, that's not what they were for. They were decoration as much as anything else. Supposedly that came from Lafayette. That's family tradition. Do we know that? Do we not? No, we don't. It came to us from the family.
Is there a possibility of exhibiting some extra items at Westfield State University?
Probably not. They're less equipped than we are to do this. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.